Yeah, it's just going to take a couple of minutes to go live and then we'll get started.
Okay, do you have the link for it?
The link for the live. Yes, here's the link. I'm putting it in the chat box.
Let's see if I can see it.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Danny Kogan. I'm the program manager at JOFA, and we're here with Dr. Naomi Baum, and we're going to learn today a little bit about her experience saying Kaddish. In this webinar, Dr. Naomi Baum will discuss her experiences saying Kaddish for her mother, a journey that she details in her recently published book, My Year of Kaddish, Mourning, Memory, and Meaning. Dr. Baum is a psychologist who has worked extensively in the field of trauma, bereavement, and resilience building, and brings her professional knowledge to bear on this most personal of odysseys. Dr. Naomi Baum is a psychologist with experience in the field of trauma and resilience building. She consults with organizations and communities worldwide in the wake of disaster, both natural and man-made. She has recently published a book, My Year of Kaddish, Mourning, Memory, and Meaning, which she'll be discussing in this webinar, exploring the process of grieving against the backdrop of her personal experience saying Kaddish. So, Dr. Baum, if you want to introduce yourself a bit, and I'm going to give the notification that if anybody has any questions or concerns about the way that the webinar is going technology and there's any glitches, to please reach out into the Q&A to JOFA.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to let you take care of the Q&As and you'll forward them to me as I talk. Okay. So first of all, good morning or good afternoon or evening, wherever you are and wherever you happen to be listening to this webinar. I would like to thank JOFA for hosting me and giving me this wonderful opportunity. I'm actually very excited about this because this is actually, in a way, my very first book launch. I published my book at the very beginning of the Corona crisis and just finally now getting off the ground to do a little bit of publicity for it. So I'm very grateful to JOFA and to you for joining me today. And I really welcome all questions that you might have about the book. So I was thinking that in presenting to you myself and the book, the first question that comes to my mind is what? Another book about Kaddish? Is that really necessary? We have a couple of books out there. There's a really nice memoir by Ari Goldman. There is a book with 52 essays of women across the spectrum discussing their experiences with Kaddish. There's a book by, a very dense book by Leo Wieseltier that also talks about Kaddish. And then there's a new book, a new novel by Nathan Englander called Kaddish.com, which I actually haven't read. It came out not so long ago. So why did I write this book? And the short answer is that it's really not another book, but it's my book. And this book is really a very personal book. When my mother passed away 3 years ago, it was 3 years ago in May, I felt that I was thrown somehow into some kind of maelstrom, some kind of whirlwind that at its core, at the eye of that storm was Kaddish. And just like the eye of the storm that is really quiet at its very center or its very core, I found that the moments of Kaddish, the moments that I said Kaddish, were very calm and very grounding and very powerful in the middle of this year that was raging with emotion, loss, bereavement, sadness, people around me also grieving, my father, my siblings. And I really wanted to share this gift that I got from saying Kaddish with my readers. So let me backtrack for a few moments. And let me introduce myself a little bit. My name is Naomi Baum. I am 65 years old. I live in Israel, in Efrat, and I am a psychologist. I've been a psychologist for over 40 years, and my field of expertise is trauma and resilience building, which means that I have been around people who have experienced trauma for a very long time. And very often trauma and loss go together. So the area, the field professionally of loss and bereavement is not new for me at all. This is something that I am familiar with and something that is very it's an area that I've spent a lot of time around. One of my beliefs in this field of work of trauma and resilience, which I have taken, I spent a lot of time in Israel working with people in the wake of terrorist attacks, and after all the various wars that we've had, the ongoing rocket attacks in Sderot. We also took this work abroad. We took this work to Haiti, to Mexico, to Spain, to Nepal. And one of the things that I have discovered in all of my work is that people are truly resilient. And what does resilience mean? It means that people have resources. Psychology very traditionally has put its focus on what's wrong with people, on a diagnosis, finding out what's missing, what we need to add to the situation. And the field of resilience, which rests heavily on the field of positive psychology, spends a lot of time looking at what resources people do have, what strengths they do encompass, what do they do when the going gets rough, because everybody does something, and there are plenty of things that work for most people. So the field of resilience really focuses on that, and that's been my goal. And I think that also is a piece of what's happening in this book. As I share my personal journey, I bring along with it my professional perspective, my professional experience, my professional outlook. But it's an outlook that's a very positive one that says that grieving and loss are a very natural part of life. And most of us are going to get through this difficult time just fine, but there are things that we can do to help ourselves. And that is exactly what I talk about in Kaddish, my year of Kaddish. So I think that one of the reasons that I wrote this book is that I bring a rather unique perspective, bringing the professional and the personal as I traveled through this most personal of journeys. I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that I am talking to a JOFA audience, and I wanted to talk about the fact that I am an Orthodox woman. And how did that impact or bear upon this book that I have written? This book was certainly not written in a vacuum. One of the most outstanding features about my experiences in Kaddish is saying Kaddish in an Orthodox shul, because that's what I did for the entire year. Not only did I say it, but I said it out loud. And for me, it was actually rather shocking, because I was surprised at the age of 62 to find that for the first time in my life that I could remember, I actually had a voice in the synagogue. I know this might sound strange to women and men who are listening to this, who perhaps belong to conservative or reform or reconstructionist congregations, but in your standard run-of-the-mill Orthodox synagogue, women do not have a voice. So that's actually something that I hadn't considered when I started to say the Kaddish. As a matter of fact, I didn't consider much of anything when I started to say Kaddish. So I think maybe what I'll do is tell you how it all began. And how it all began is actually in, oh, I see it comes out mirror image, but this is the book. How it all begins is chapter 1. And I thought maybe I would read just a little bit of, no, I think maybe I'll tell you the story. It's kind of a long chapter. So I'm going to tell you the story. So the story goes like this. My mom, who was almost 91 years old, her name is Adeline Lowenberg, Chaya Levenberg. My parents moved to Israel way back in 1971, and my parents lived right near me in Efrat. I was very involved in my mother's physical care in the last year of her life. And when she passed, and I had spent the last several weeks really very much tuned into the fact that she was going to be departing this world. This was not a surprise for us. This was really something quite expected. So much so that I had begun to actually write the eulogy first in my head and then put things down on paper. But the thought of Kaddish never, ever even crossed my mind, not even once. So how did I get to saying it? How did that come about? There we were at the cemetery. The cemetery is not far from our house. It's a regional cemetery, probably about the most beautiful cemetery there is in Israel, the cemetery in Kfar Etzion. And we're sitting in the place where the funeral service is to be conducted. It's kind of like this big room, a hall sort of, and there are seats set up for family members right at the front. And I'm sitting there between my sister and my father. I have two brothers, a sister and a father. And the rabbi who's in charge of the Chevra Kaddish comes over to us with 3 Kaddish cards. And he gives one to one brother, he gives one to the next brother, and I assume that he was giving the next one to my father, which he did. My father immediately passed the card on to me. And I said, Dad, this is for me? This is for you. And he goes, no, this is for you. I said, really? He said, I don't have an obligation to say Kaddish, only the children do. And at that point, he inadvertently, I think, set me off on this year-long journey, which was really an incredible journey. And when I talked with my dad later about this, and my dad, he should live and be well, is now 94 years old. When I talked to him later, he had absolutely no recollection of this event, but it is engraved in my mind because I remember that surprise, like, wait, I'm going to say Kaddish? I should say Kaddish? Should I say Kaddish? And then all of a sudden, as I was sitting there, in really the minute or two before the funeral was to begin, I flashed on a picture of Racheli Frankel. She was one of the mothers who had lost her son to the terrorist attack. There were 3 boys that were kidnapped. This was back before Tzuk Eitan. I can't even remember now exactly what year that was. Let me just think, 2014, I think, 2014, probably 6 years ago. So at the cemetery, after they discovered her son's body and the other 2 bodies, at the funeral, she said Kaddish out loud at the cemetery. And I remember seeing that at the time and thinking, wow, that's really something. Here she is. She's a Talmudic scholar, a very special person, staunchly within the Orthodox tradition. And here she is saying Kaddish. So I flashed on that picture and I said, you know what? I'm going to say Kaddish. And of course, what I meant is I was going to say Kaddish at the funeral. And at the funeral, there are several times when you say Kaddish. So the first time I I barely got any words out. And the second and third time, I think I broke down in the middle. When we got to the grave site, there's a very long and complicated Kaddish, which is entirely different. But by this time I was already more on board, and my brothers were helping me out. And when we got home from the cemetery and said Ma'ariv at home, I said Kaddish. And I thought to myself that night, well, I guess I'll say Kaddish for the week. I mean, I hadn't even thought about it. I didn't know. I was confused. I was like involved with what was going on with losing my mother. It was a very emotional time. So I said, all right, I'm going to say it for the week. And that's how my journey took off. I started first with the week, and then at the end of the week debated about what next. And I had a good friend who said to me, don't bite off more than you can chew. Go slowly, take your time. So I said, okay, I did a week, now I'll do a month. We'll go up to the Shloshim. In the Jewish tradition, it's very nice. You have these markers where you can pause. So, I could have at any point said, okay, I had enough. So at the Shloshim, by the time I got to the end of the Shloshim, I was really already very much involved, very much on board. And that really pulled me along. As the year progressed, I wrote a lot. I've been writing for quite a while, first professionally and then personally. I wrote another book about my experiences with breast cancer. It's similar in a way because I combine my personal and professional experiences in that book as well. It's called Life Unexpected, a trauma psychologist's journeys through breast cancer. So both of these books are kind of like a combination, personal and professional. And really, that's kind of the way I live my life. That's the way I live my professional life as well. I bring a lot of the personal into all of the work that I do. So once I got really involved in saying Kaddish, I wrote a lot about it. And at the end of the year, I decided to put a lot of these pieces together, flesh it out some more. And I really wanted this book to be a support for women like myself who might want to say Kaddish, but who might be concerned that it won't be so easy, it won't be so acceptable. And there were issues and there were challenges along the way, which I detail in the book. What I found, though, most strongly, and for me, what was most remarkable about this whole period of saying Kaddish was that the Kaddish gave me a place to mourn. Every single day, I decided to say Kaddish once a day. I took that prerogative of being a woman and saying, okay, I don't know if I can handle 3 times a day, but once a day I'm going to commit to. And mostly I davened in the morning, I davened Shachrit, I said the early morning prayers. And what I found is that it was a wonderful place for me to set my grief, to hold my mourning by having this ritual that happened every single day. I was living my life during this year alongside the loss of my mother. The loss of my mother was very central. And what happens in our modern society is that there's so often very little room for strong emotions such as grief and sadness. I think in secular society, it's even worse that, you have a memorial service, you have a wake, and then people get up and are finished and it's back to work 2 days later, 1 day later, and that's it, it's gone, it's finished. So how do people mourn, and where is this place? We know that mourning is a process. We know that it takes time. So what I found is that saying Kaddish really gave me a place to rest my grief, to explore it, to touch it, to feel it, to be with it. There was no rushing through this. There was no get it over with quickly, because it happened every single day. Every single day I was in the synagogue. Every single day I sat there for 35 or 40 minutes waiting to say my Kaddish. Every single day, as it were, I was put on that hot seat and reminded that my mother was no longer with me. I couldn't ignore that. I couldn't kind of go along as if nothing had happened. I was there because she had died. And why is this so important? I think that in our lives, we are often so busy and so easily distracted that actually focusing on events or feelings or actions that make us feel uncomfortable, we avoid it. We avoid these feelings at all costs. We feel unsettled. We feel uncomfortable. And so we run away. Kaddish did not allow me to do that. Kaddish brought me back again and again and again to the fact that my mother was gone. So by saying Kaddish, I was able to face up to what was going on in my life. I had the time and the space to feel the feelings, and very often, I have to say, very often, as I said Kaddish, I always thought about my mother. I never said it by rote. And very often I was awash in tears, particularly in those first few weeks and months. As the months rolled on, the tears subsided, but thoughts about my mother didn't. They really didn't. They were there. They were there right with me. And I think I know from all of my work in resilience that the ability to experience the entire gamut of emotions, from fear and sadness and pain to happiness and joy, when you experience one, you can experience the other. If you shut yourself off from one kind of emotion, inevitably you freeze yourself out of really feeling and being present to your emotions. So I really feel that this Kaddish was a gift for me in terms of allowing me to feel. So that's the piece related to resilience. I'm going to go on for about another 7 or 8 minutes, and then I'm going to open up to questions. I'm going to just turn on my fan. It's getting awfully warm here. Hang on. Okay, there we go. So back to being in an Orthodox shul, I wanted to talk about that again a little bit more. In my book, I write about how I spent my time behind the mechitza, usually behind the mechitza. I have a chapter in my book called Kaddish in a Bikini. That may sound like an odd title. Well, you're going to have to read the book to find out why. But there was a place, and I talk about also the various interesting places that I went to and said Kaddish in. Because I was working during the year, I said Kaddish. I said Kaddish in Manchester, England. I said Kaddish in Kathmandu, Nepal, and Pokhara, Nepal. I said Kaddish in Cyprus. I said Kaddish, where else? I'm trying to think where else. All over Israel. Lots of different kinds of congregations in Israel. And I reflect upon the various different experiences in the various synagogues. But for the most part, I said Kaddish in my neighborhood synagogue, which is 1 minute outside of my door. And I must admit, I will confess to you here today that if I did not have a synagogue that was so close to my home, I don't know if I would have been able to keep it up. I had really no excuses not to say Kaddish. My kids were all grown. I didn't have to take care of anybody in the morning but myself. I'm an early riser by nature, and the synagogue is right outside my front door, a very small synagogue located in a bomb shelter, which is not untypical in Israel. And so most of the year I was in this synagogue, which really has a minyan of men, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 men on a good day, and me behind the mechitza. So the mechitza, well, a lot of mixed feelings about mechitza, but in this case, I call it that glorious mechitza. Why glorious? On the one hand, I have definitely grown up behind a mechitza. That's the way I was brought up. It feels comfortable. It feels comfortable to me to be with other women when I pray. On the other hand, it underscores for me the lack of inclusion, being unseen, and usually unheard. But for me in this case, first of all, I wasn't unheard. And it was glorious indeed because I had my own little den, my own little cave. You can picture the scene that where you go into the bomb shelter, the men are all in the front. The mechitza was wood and it had another curtain on top. People really couldn't see me. If I wanted to see them, I could pull back the curtain, but usually I didn't. Once I figured out that I didn't have to say every single prayer, in the beginning, it was really a race. I felt very stressed and very, it was difficult for me to keep up. And that was one, I spent quite a bit of time talking about that as well in the book, how surprising it was for me. I grew up in this tradition. Why was it so hard for me to keep up? Didn't I know the prayers? The bottom line is no. When did I ever pray with a minyan in the morning? I didn't. I went to shul on Shabbat. So it was difficult for me keeping up. My brothers were extremely helpful and very supportive in the beginning. Is the first week. That was critical, I think. But once I realized that I could skip around a little bit, I didn't have to say everything. I kind of let up on myself. Once I realized that, I really enjoyed being on the other side of the mechitza. I really could do my own thing. And I did my own thing. I meditated, I studied Mishnah, I did Qigong. Qigong, for those of you who don't know, is a Chinese meditative movement. I'm an instructor of Qigong, so I did some Qigong there. I drank my coffee. I brought my coffee with me every morning. The first few weeks, I would try to get the coffee in before I left. Didn't manage, maybe one little sip. And then I said, wait a minute, why not bring it with me? And where did I get this idea from of bringing coffee to shul? When I was in Nepal, I visited a monastery, and the monastery, I got up early one morning to see their prayer service. And I was amazed by how much it reminded me of davening. There were these young boys sitting in rows with scrolls of parchment with letters that were unintelligible to me, mumbling or saying or singing prayers that were unintelligible to me. It looked very familiar. The only thing that wasn't familiar was there was a person who was walking by and pouring out chai to every person there. So as you said your prayers, you drank your chai. And I thought, well, gee, that's a great idea. I think we should adopt that into our shul. And before long, I had the opportunity when I realized that since I was sitting behind the mechitza, nobody could care less what I was doing there. Nobody would ever know. So I would get to shul for that first Kaddish, which is right at the beginning, say that first Kaddish, and then sit down, breathe, and drink my coffee. So I actually loved the mechitza. And just to end, I just want to say for a few moments about the actual Kaddish itself. Every time, as I mentioned before, every time that I stood to say the Kaddish, I could actually feel myself being enveloped by my mother, by her spirit, by God. For me, it was really a very special and a very holy time. I could almost physically feel her. I could see her. All sorts of memories came up to me. And I felt that what I was doing was really important to honor my mother's memory and to help her soul, even though I didn't and still don't till this day quite understand what that means. But the upshot of it all was that in the end, I was really very much a beneficiary of this whole process of saying Kaddish. And in writing this book, My Year of Kaddish, Mourning, Memory, and Meaning, I hope that other women will be encouraged to say Kaddish, to find their voice in the synagogue, and to make a place for their mourning in this world that we live in, that it's very easy to be distracted and very easy to get on with life and not take the time that is really so necessary to mourn and mourn properly, mourn with grace, mourn with honor. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Danny, and the questions, okay? I have not looked at the chat, so
Great.
there.
Hi, thank you so much for leading us in this webinar. So in addition to putting it up on this Zoom, I also have posted on the Facebook Live link that if anybody watching on Facebook has any questions for Dr. Baum, that they should type it in there, and I will also keep my eye on any comments or questions coming in through there. We have a few questions, and anybody should feel free to message me at the JOFA site, the JOFA panel link, or in the Q&A. So the first question I have for you is if you can speak a bit about how you were different at the end of the year as compared to the beginning of the year, and to say a bit more about what happened to the quality of your morning over the course of the year.
Okay, so as I mentioned, at the beginning of the year, when I would say Kaddish, very often I was overcome with tears. And as time went on, things settled down. In the beginning, I was really flooded with emotion, flooded with memories. My mother had been declining for many years, and as many elderly people do. And after she was gone, I was able to reclaim those very early memories, memories from my early childhood, from my middle childhood, from my adolescence. I was able to reclaim that. And that was really a blessing. I felt that, and I know that really from the literature and what helps people mourn, that if you are able to access memories that actually can support and feed, there's an expression in Hebrew, escapes me right now in English, but actually a memory that is substantial, a memory that can support you, then that's a wonderful thing. And these memories were gifts. So I felt that while saying Kaddish, that's what was happening in the beginning. As time went on, I became much more aware of the community around me and the other people who were saying Kaddish with me. There were very few times that I said Kaddish with other women. There was one very critical point of time right at the beginning. I went away for a weekend with a group of women and their spouses and my spouse, women that I studied Talmud with, and we went away for the weekend. And there was another woman who lost her father within a week of when her mother died, and we said Kaddish together. And that was like very early on. We really supported ourselves in that. We supported each other, and the first time I said Kaddish outside of someplace that was comfortable and familiar. As the year went on, the Kaddish became a lot more familiar. It never became rote. It was always a priority. It always felt special, but there is a process of mourning. Mourning, you change during mourning. Mourning was central to my entire existence for the year because of the Kaddish, but the quality of it changed. It was less intense. It was perhaps more reflective, maybe a little bit less emotional. By writing, it also gave me a time to reflect. I started talking a lot to people about Kaddish, other women who said Kaddish. Yeah, it did change over the course of the year.
Great, and I'm going to say that, again, you can comment on Facebook with any questions, but we've already had 2 comments from women who really resonate with what you're saying, including one who says that they've already bought your book and that it came in the mail and they're excited to read it. So the next question for you is if you can address the dialectic between the inside, intimate, private mourning and the connection of minyan goers or the other mourners.
Right. So actually what I've spoken about most in this talk is about the personal, the very personal, the intimate, what goes on inside of me and inside of my head. But what's so interesting about Kaddish is that you say it in community. You, according to Jewish tradition, that is. I recently, just last week, I met a woman who told me that she said Kaddish every day for her mother. And I looked at her, I was a little surprised because she is from a very Chiloni, a very secular background. And I said to her, you said Kaddish? And she said, yes, I said Kaddish every day. No, not in a synagogue. I said it at home. And I said, oh, that's really great. And I do think that's great because by saying Kaddish, no matter where you say it, it really sets aside a time for that morning. And that's very special. But because I'm a traditional Jew and I say Kaddish in a minyan, and that minyan is 10 men. It's not 10 women, it's 10 men. Although there are opinions that you can say, certainly Kaddish de Rabbanan, you can say with 10 women. For the most part, actually for the entire year, I said Kaddish with a minyan of men. And that reflection about how community intersects with mourning, I think is really essential. And I felt it more, I think, when I observed some of the other mourners. About 2 months after my mom died, a neighbor lost his son in an army accident. It was a terrible, it's always terrible. And this was awful. He lost his 22-year-old son and he was bereft. Bereft would be, it's an understatement. I can't even describe the levels of his grief. And yet he pulled himself out of bed and came to shul every single day to say Kaddish. And I thought to myself, wow, if this man didn't have Kaddish to say, he would never get out of bed again. He just wouldn't. He would stay in that place. And here he was, he had to get out of bed. He had to come to shul. He had to do it 3 times a day, interact with people. This is a way of really beginning to heal, to bring yourself back into community, back into talking with people, back into feeling supported. Because when you say that Kaddish, you have the response, you have the answering, you say your piece, and then the community says amen, and you say your next piece and the community says amen, and then they say Yehei Shmei. So there's this conversation that you're having, you're leading it, and the community is responding, and it feels both supportive and responsive. And the way I realized it is the one time when nobody responded to my Kaddish, and I have a chapter about that in my book also, about a Kaddish, a particular Kaddish I said in a particular place where I said Kaddish and nobody answered, not the men and not the women. And it's interesting, I give the women a lot more leeway here because when I davened in shul with other women, I could very hardly ever hear their amen. I could hardly hear their response. And I realized that really women are used to not having a voice in shul, Orthodox women. And I know that when I go to shul, I sing, I have a loud voice and I sing at the top of my lungs, but I'm just about the only one. Sometimes my daughter will say to me, shh, quiet down. But women just don't speak up in shul. So I relied on the men, and in my daily practice, the men were really very supportive and very kind to me, and were very happy to make sure that there was a minyan for me to say Kaddish. I felt very supported the entire year by all the men in the synagogue. And until this day, I really feel like, I would talk to them before services, after services, and I really got a vote of support from all of them. So community, very important. Being a woman, the only woman, I considered to myself what it would be like if there were other women there. And I think it would have been nice. but I really enjoyed being alone too.
So thank you. And on that note, I have another question. Is a lot of women I know don't say Kaddish when they have brothers because they feel that they took care of their parent when they were alive, and now it's their brother's turn to help their parents have a good death. Do you have any responses or any feelings about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It occurred to me at a certain point that most of the women that I know who said Kaddish were actually women who were girls who didn't have boys in their family. They were sisters and no brothers. Those are not entirely true. It's not 100%, but many of the women that I know that said Kaddish felt that it was their obligation to say for a parent because there weren't boys. In my family, there were two boys, one of whom was saying Kaddish every single day. He didn't miss for anything, and I knew he would never miss. And if, once he had to get on an airplane, he asked my father to pinch hit for him. Because my father goes to shul every day, and my father wasn't saying Kaddish, which I thought was really interesting, but he said it wasn't his obligation to say Kaddish after the first month. So my brothers were very supportive. They never felt, I think, that I usurped them. They really helped me out in those first days. They would kind of give me the high sign, tell me which Kaddish was coming up, what I needed to say. They were really very helpful, very much on board. The fact that my brothers were saying Kaddish, it was great. I mean, it was fine, but it didn't really have too much to do with me. I didn't feel like it absolved me of an obligation. And I didn't look at it so much as an obligation, but as an opportunity that I really could do something in a spiritual way. I could do something in the synagogue. I could do something for my mother's soul. I could do something for my mother. I didn't want to be absolved of that. And it is true that my parents live right near me. They don't live near my brothers. And it is true that I took care of my mom. They were all terrifically helpful, all my siblings. They were very supportive, but by nature, by virtue of the fact that I live right around the corner from them, more of the caretaking fell upon me. But no, I didn't have any sense like, okay, I did my share, now you do yours. I really felt like it was an opportunity.
Okay, and we have one more question. This one feels extremely relevant. Is that in the time of COVID-19, of the coronavirus, do you have any words to say for the people who have not had the opportunity to mourn in a community with a minyan, or to sit Shiva while receiving visitors? And if you have anything that can help them.
Yes. Yes. So I think that this is really a challenge. And I actually thought about starting my talk with that. It's really a challenge to, we've had so many challenges during these last couple months, but mourning has been a very, very significant challenge because mourning in community is so important. That week of Shiva is so critical in feeling supported and feeling that people acknowledge your loss. All that is really important. And that gets lost. So what can a person do? And I think that's where the notion of making a ritual and having a time and place, even if it's personal, even if it's by myself, to mourn can be really, really important. One of the things that happened during the year is that I needed to travel to Nepal, and I knew I wouldn't have a minyan for 2 weeks, just on Shabbat. I wouldn't have it during the week. And I looked into what's called Kaddish Yachid. And this is something that I've actually written a blog about. I have a chapter about it. There's a Kaddish written and incorporated into the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon, who is from the 7th century. It's very, very old, and it's called Kaddish Yachid. And it's to be said when you are not with a minyan. And it's interesting to count on. The history of Kaddish is very interesting. I have a chapter about that in my book as well. But it's interesting to contemplate that if you think about it, people lived in agrarian communities. They very often did not live in a place where there were 10 men who could attend minyan on a daily basis. So my guess is that for many, many, many people, Kaddish was not an option, Kaddish in a minyan. And that's what the Kaddish Yachid addresses. It is a prayer, a very beautiful prayer, similar in some ways to the Kaddish that we say, different in other ways. And it is a way to make a place and a time for your loss, and also say a prayer for the soul of the departed. So it's called Kaddish Yachid, the Kaddish for the individual. And it's certainly worth exploring. And I would just add on to that, during this time of COVID, I think it's important to make a time and a place. If, Kaddish was the ritual for me, and I acknowledge that for not everybody, not even all Orthodox women are interested in saying Kaddish. But what I do think is it is important to find a time and a place to play for that grief. And it could be a personal ritual of another sort. Once again, for me, Kaddish was the way to do it. I would just encourage secular people, people who don't find Kaddish as their way, to explore what else they can do to make a place and a time for their mourning. Because when you mourn, you can also experience great joy.
Okay, so thank you so much. We have, since there's a little lag on Facebook, I'm going to say right now again that if anybody has any last minute questions, that they should post it now. But we've had several comments on the webinar so far on Facebook, and a couple in the chat already. So thank you for engaging so many listeners. And yeah, great. I hope that you have a healthy and safe rest of the week, and Shabbat Shalom to you and to everyone listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me. Bye-bye.
Bye.